A 10-year-old girl boards a flight, excited to visit her father. But minutes after settling into her first-class seat, everything shifts. A flight attendant approaches with a polite smile but cold eyes, asking her to move to economy. Confused but compliant, the young girl quietly gathers her things as passengers watch in silence. What happened next sparked outrage, exposing the hidden biases that often go unspoken and igniting a conversation that reached far beyond the cabin walls. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if this resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that challenge and inspire. This isn't just about one flight. The airport was alive with its usual symphony, rolling suitcases humming like distant bees. The clipped voices of announcements weaving in and out of hurried conversations. Amyra Ellison barely noticed any of it. At 10 years old, the world still held a softness around its edges. And to her, this trip was an adventure. A new story to tuck into the pages of her journal. Elijah Ellison had kissed her forehead that morning, straightening the collar of her dress with the kind of care that fathers reserve for their daughters, their pride and fragile hope wrapped in small gestures. "Remember, Seat 2A, he had said, slipping the boarding pass into her hand. His eyes lingered a moment longer. "You belong there, Amyra. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The words seemed strange at the time. Too weighty for something as simple as a plane ride. Amyra nodded, not fully understanding but trusting her father the way children do. As she boarded, the brightness of the first-class cabin stretched before her. Wide and luxurious. She placed her pink carry-on bag in the overhead compartment with a bit of effort. Feeling the eyes of a few passengers flick her way, she smoothed her dress and settled into her seat, pulling her journal from the bag, ready to sketch the new view out the window. Sarah Cole watched from a distance. The cabin's soft lighting smoothed the years on her face, but in the sharp angles of her posture, there was no mistaking her authority. She had spent decades in this industry, navigating turbulence in the air and on the ground. Her uniform was pressed to perfection, her heels clicking with quiet command as she moved through the aisles. But when her eyes fell on Amyra, something unreadable crossed her face there and gone in the space of a breath. Sarah wasn't unkind by nature, but she was tired in the way that makes small compromises feel justified. Years of working beneath glass ceilings that never quite cracked had made her cautious, selective in who she extended grace to. She had learned long ago that protecting her place often meant defending unspoken rules. Rules she no longer questioned. The phone at the service station buzzed. Ethan Reynolds' voice, smooth and deliberate, greeted her. "Sarah, I need you to handle something for me." Ethan wasn't just her superior. He was the hand that had pulled her back from the brink of career-ending mistakes more than once. His requests, though framed as favors, rarely left room for negotiation. "There's a client boarding tonight, Charles Abrams. He needs to be taken care of." Sarah's brow furrowed. "We're fully booked in first." "Ethan, I'm sure you'll figure something out," he replied, his tone edged with expectation. When the call ended, Sarah scanned the manifest. Seat 2A, Amyra Ellison, a child, alone. Her eyes lingered on the name. Sarah knew there were open seats in economy. And there it was, the easy answer. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing against her, the way it always did when the line between right and easy blurred. "She's just a kid." But Ethan's voice echoed louder. Sarah moved toward Amyra's seat with the kind of smile that concealed more than it revealed. "Excuse me, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft but clipped. "May I see your boarding pass?" Amyra looked up, eyes wide with surprise. "Sure," she replied, fishing the folded paper from her bag. She handed it over carefully, her fingers brushing against Sarah's in the exchange. Sarah's eyes traced the seat assignment, 2A, first class. The child's name seemed to stare back at her, daring her to reconsider. "I'm afraid there's been a mistake," Sarah said, the words leaving her lips faster than she could question them. Amyra blinked. "But, my dad booked this seat." Sarah's smile thinned, though she tried to soften the edges of her voice. "I understand. Sometimes there are mix-ups. I'll need you to move to another seat. It's still a nice one. I promise." Passengers shifted in their seats, eyes darting away as though they hadn't heard. No one wanted to bear witness. Amyra hesitated, something inside her, a small, unfamiliar weight tightened. She thought of her father's words. the certainty in his voice when he said she belonged here. "But, this is my seat," Amyra repeated, her voice steadier now. Sarah's fingers gripped the clipboard a little tighter. "I'm sorry, but the decision's been made." For a long moment, Amyra sat frozen, clutching the journal in her lap. The air felt heavier now, and the hum of the cabin seemed to press in from all sides. Finally, with quiet deliberation, she gathered her things, her small frame rising from the wide leather seat. As Amyra walked down the aisle, past rows of passengers who met her with awkward glances or pretended not to see, Sarah felt something flicker in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't pride or relief. It was smaller than that, more hollow. Vanessa, a younger flight attendant, caught Amyra's eye as she passed. "Would you like some help with your bag?" she asked gently. But Sarah shot her a look that silenced the offer. "No need," Sarah said. Amyra settled into the economy seat near the back, placing her journal on the tray table. She opened it carefully, flipping to a blank page. Her pencil hovered for a moment. The tip pressed lightly to the paper. Then, with the smallest sigh, she began to draw. The air felt different in economy, denser, heavier somehow. The seats were closer together, the hum of voices louder, less restrained. Amyra settled in by the window, her pink carry-on tucked beneath her feet, knees barely grazing the seat in front of her. She opened her journal, not to write but to give her hands something to do, to keep them from trembling. The plane hadn't even left the ground, but Amyra already felt miles away from where she had started. From the front of the cabin, Sarah Cole walked briskly, her posture unbending as she resumed her duties in first class. She poured champagne, exchanged pleasantries with passengers who sat comfortably beneath warm blankets. Occasionally, her eyes flickered toward the curtain separating first from economy. But only briefly. She told herself she had done the right thing, hadn't she? A child doesn't need first class. Charles Abrams was a man with influence, someone who mattered. She believed this the way people believe in the structure of things that have stood unchanged for too long. But something lingered, gnawed at the edge of her thoughts. Vanessa O'Connell noticed. She had watched it all, the way Sarah's smile tightened when Amyra insisted. The way the girl's small shoulders squared even as she gathered her things. Vanessa had wanted to step in, but she was new, and newness came with its own kind of silence. Now, she hovered near the galley, half listening as Sarah spoke with another attendant about the weather delay out of Denver. Vanessa's eyes kept drifting toward the back of the plane. Amyra sat quietly, her journal open but untouched. Through the window, the sky stretched endlessly, but the horizon line felt impossibly distant. It wasn't the seat that mattered, not really. It was something else, something Amyra couldn't quite name but felt all the same. She remembered her father's words that morning. "You belong there." The memory felt fragile now, like something delicate and easily shattered, as if summoned by her thoughts. Sarah passed through the aisle again, heels clicking faintly against the floor. Amyra lifted her gaze, their eyes locking for just a second. Sarah looked away, and Amyra, feeling the sting of that small rejection, returned to her journal. She began to draw not the view from the window, but the woman who had taken her seat. Sarah's sharp features took shape on the page, but as Amyra sketched, she softened them. She made Sarah's eyes gentler, her expression kinder. Perhaps it was easier to rewrite things this way. The plane leveled out, and the seatbelt sign flickered off. Passengers began shifting, adjusting tray tables, unfolding newspapers. In first class, the sound of wine glasses clinking carried faintly through the cabin. Amyra's tray table rattled suddenly, and she realized, too late, that the small plastic cup of juice she had been given was tilting dangerously. She lunged forward to steady it, but the juice spilled across the surface, seeping into the edges of her journal. Her heart sank. She pressed napkins against the stain, but the paper soaked it up greedily, leaving behind faint orange marks. Amyra's hand hovered over the call button. She hesitated. Vanessa appeared by her side a moment later, holding a handful of clean napkins. She knelt gently, dabbing at the spill with practiced hands. "Let me help you," Vanessa said, her voice soft. "Thank you," Amyra whispered. Vanessa smiled, but the warmth in her eyes was brief. She glanced toward the front of the plane, where Sarah lingered. There were rules about stepping out of line. As Vanessa cleaned the last of the spill, Amyra tugged lightly on her sleeve. "Can I ask you something?" Amyra's voice was small but steady. Of course. Did I do something wrong? Vanessa's hand stilled for a moment. Her eyes flickered with something Amyra couldn't quite place: sadness. Maybe. Or anger. No, sweetheart, Vanessa said quietly. You didn't do anything wrong. Amyra nodded, but the knot in her chest remained. Up front, Sarah Cole overheard fragments of conversation drifting from first class. Did you see how she made that little girl move? She's just a kid. Didn't seem right. Sarah's spine stiffened. She forced her expression into something neutral. But the weight of those words pressed against her skin. A part of her wanted to explain. To justify. It wasn't personal. It was business. But even she wasn't sure if that was true. Later, as Sarah collected empty glasses from the cabin, a man in seat 3C leaned closer. His voice low but pointed. That girl back there, was she supposed to be in first? Sarah's smile thinned. There was a mix-up with the seating chart. It's been handled. The man nodded but said nothing more. Still, his silence felt louder than words. Sarah pressed forward, but with every step, the distance between her and the truth narrowed. When the plane began its descent, Amyra watched the clouds drift below the wings. She didn't draw anymore. Her journal lay closed on her lap, the stain spreading faintly across the cover. As they touched down, Amyra exhaled deeply. The tension she hadn't realized she was holding easing just slightly. Passengers stood, gathering their things. Sarah remained near the exit, clipboard in hand, but as Amyra passed, their eyes met one final time. I hope you have a good evening, Sarah said automatically. Amyra paused. She lifted her chin slightly, just enough to meet Sarah's gaze without flinching. Thank you, Amyra replied, her voice steady in a way that left Sarah standing still, even as the crowd moved around them. In the terminal, Elijah waited, his tall frame easily recognizable in the sea of travelers. When Amyra spotted him, she broke into a run, her arms wrapping around him tightly. How was the flight? Elijah asked, brushing a curl from her forehead. Amyra hesitated for just a moment. It was fine, she said, her voice soft but sure. But Elijah noticed the faint stain on her journal, the way her fingers held onto it just a little tighter than usual. And in the quiet space between them, he knew there was more to the story. Elijah Ellison knew something was wrong the moment Amyra's small hand slid into his at the terminal. She smiled, but the light behind her eyes was dimmed like a candle flickering in a draft. He didn't press her. Not yet. Ready for spaghetti and garlic bread? He asked, his voice light. Amyra nodded eagerly, but her fingers fidgeted with the corner of her journal, the faint stain of orange juice catching the overhead lights as they walked. Elijah's gaze lingered on it, tracing the edges of the stain with quiet recognition. By the time they reached home, the smell of simmering marinara filled the kitchen. Amyra set her journal down on the table, flipping to a fresh page to draw while Elijah stirred the sauce. Long flight? He asked casually, glancing over his shoulder. It was okay, she replied. The response was too quick, too rehearsed. Elijah heard the hesitation beneath her words like an echo in an empty room. As they sat down to eat, Amyra's fork moved absent-mindedly, pushing pasta in slow circles. Elijah let the silence stretch, letting her feel it not as a weight, but as space to decide how much of herself she wanted to share. Finally, she spoke. The flight attendant moved me, Amyra said softly, her eyes fixed on the plate. Elijah's fork hovered mid-air. Moved you? Yeah, from first class to the back. She said there was a mistake. The simplicity of her words made Elijah's chest tighten. He set his fork down carefully, the scrape of metal against porcelain louder than it should have been. I see, Elijah said, his voice measured. Amyra glanced up at him, searching his face for a reaction. She wasn't sure what she expected: anger, maybe disappointment, but Elijah's expression was calm, though something in his eyes flickered with quiet fire. Did she say why? He asked. Amyra shook her head. I asked, but she didn't explain. Elijah nodded slowly. He leaned back in his chair, studying his daughter in the warm glow of the kitchen. She was small for 10, but she carried herself with a steadiness that reminded him so much of Evelyn, calm, but unyielding when it mattered. Did it make you feel strange? He asked, watching her carefully. Amyra hesitated, pencil tapping lightly against the open journal by her plate. Yeah, she admitted, like I wasn't supposed to be there. Those words, simple and unadorned, carried the weight of generations. Elijah felt them settle over him like lead, heavy and familiar. Later that night, when Amyra was tucked into bed, Elijah sat alone at the kitchen table. Her journal lay open in front of him, the sketch of the flight attendant staring back at him from the page. Amyra had softened Sarah's features, as if forgiveness could be penciled in alongside sharp lines. Elijah traced the outline of the drawing with his finger, remembering his own childhood, how his father used to return from work at the docks, his hands calloused and heavy with unspoken battles. "There will be days," his father once told him, "when they'll look at you and see what they want to see. Not who you are, not what you deserve." Elijah hadn't fully understood at the time, but now, as a father himself, he understood all too well. The next morning, he found himself dialing a number he hadn't called in a long time. Evelyn answered on the second ring. "She's okay," Elijah said before Evelyn could ask. But something happened on the flight. Elijah told her everything. Amyra's quiet voice at dinner, the way she clutched her journal tighter than usual. Evelyn's silence on the other end spoke volumes. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but sharp. "This isn't the first time," she said. "No," Elijah agreed, "it isn't." They both knew the pattern, the small slights that whispered louder than shouts. A child, alone, was easy to dismiss. It wasn't malice, not in the way people often imagined. No one had shouted, no one had pointed, but that was the thing about this kind of injustice: it was polite. Quiet, delivered with a smile and an apology, wrapped in words like policy and procedure. And that made it harder to fight. "Do you want me to handle it?" Evelyn asked. Elijah smiled faintly. Evelyn had always been quick to action. She was sharp in ways he admired, unafraid to knock on doors that refused to open. "No," Elijah said softly. "This one's mine." Elijah's arrival at the airline's corporate office was understated but deliberate. He wasn't interested in making a scene, not yet. Ethan Reynolds greeted him with a broad smile, stepping from behind a glass-paneled office. "Elijah," Ethan said, extending a hand. "Good to see you. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Elijah shook his hand firmly but didn't smile. "It's about Amyra." Ethan's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered. I heard she was on one of our flights. I hope she enjoyed the trip." Elijah's eyes narrowed, measuring the space between them. Ethan's tone was casual, but Elijah recognized the deflection for what it was. "There was an incident," Elijah said plainly. "She was moved from her seat in first class." Ethan's brow furrowed. "I'm sure it was just a mix-up. These things happen." Elijah's jaw tightened. "These things," Elijah repeated slowly, "shouldn't happen." Ethan shifted slightly, suddenly aware of the weight behind Elijah's words. "Elijah, let's not blow this out of proportion. I'm sure Sarah had her reasons. She's one of our best flight attendants." Elijah leaned forward, resting his hands on the edge of Ethan's desk. His voice was calm, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "My daughter didn't deserve to feel small, Ethan, not for the sake of someone else's comfort." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Elijah continued, his voice dropping lower. "I'm not asking for apologies. I'm asking for change. Quiet injustice is still injustice. And if you can't see that, then maybe you're part of the problem." The room was silent for a long moment. Finally, Ethan nodded, though reluctantly. "I'll look into it," he said. Elijah met his gaze, holding it for a beat longer than necessary. "See that you do." As Elijah left the office, he exhaled slowly, the weight of the conversation settling over him. This was only the beginning. The quiet battles were often the longest. But Elijah Ellison had never been one to back down. Elijah sat at the kitchen table long after the house had gone quiet. The faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound that remained. Amyra's journal lay open in front of him, the faint orange stain spreading like a bruise across the corner of the page. The sketch of Sarah Cole stared back at him, softened by Amyra's hand. The innocence in her pencil strokes felt like a quiet plea, a child's attempt to redraw the world into something gentler than it was. Elijah traced the lines of the drawing with his finger, but the weight behind his eyes told him this wasn't something that could be erased with a softer line. Injustice, he thought, rarely announces itself with a raised fist or a slur. Sometimes it slips through the cracks in the form of indifference, averted eyes, polite dismissals, the small violences wrapped in smiles. And now, it had touched Amyra. The phone buzzed, vibrating against the table. Evelyn's name glowed on the screen. "She's asleep," Elijah said quietly, as if Amyra might hear him from upstairs. Evelyn exhaled on the other end. I can't stop thinking about it. Neither could Elijah. You should have seen her, Elijah said, his voice tightening. She didn't break down. She didn't cry. She just accepted it, like she already knew the world could be that way. She shouldn't have to know that, Evelyn replied. Her voice trembled with a restrained anger that Elijah understood all too well. No, she shouldn't, Elijah agreed. A silence stretched between them, long and familiar. They had both lived enough years to know that this wasn't new. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a system. A quiet machine that hummed beneath the surface of everyday life. You spoke to Ethan? Evelyn asked. I did, Elijah replied. He said he'd look into it. Evelyn laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Ethan's been looking into things for years. Somehow, nothing ever changes. Elijah's hand tightened around the edge of the table. This time it will. You really believe that? I have to. The next morning, Elijah drove Amyra to school. She sat quietly in the backseat, her journal balanced on her knees. She didn't draw. At a red light, Elijah glanced at her through the rearview mirror. Amyra, he began carefully. How did it make you feel when she asked you to move? Amyra didn't look up. Her pencil traced idle circles along the edge of the journal's cover. Like I didn't belong, she said finally. Elijah's grip on the steering wheel tightened. But I know I did, she added, lifting her eyes to meet his gaze in the mirror. There was something steady in her voice. Something Elijah recognized from the long line of Ellisons that came before her. Elijah nodded, swallowing the lump rising in his throat. You did, he said softly. When they arrived at school, Amyra leaned over to kiss his cheek before slipping out of the car. She walked toward the entrance with her head high, but Elijah's eyes stayed on her until she disappeared through the doors. Elijah spent the afternoon sifting through paperwork in his home office, but his mind wasn't on contracts or client calls. His thoughts circled back to Sarah Cole, to Ethan, to the long shadow of that single flight. The doorbell rang just as he was closing his laptop. Vanessa O'Connell stood on the porch, shifting nervously from foot to foot. Her uniform was crisp, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her discomfort. Mr. Ellison, she began, offering a tentative smile. I hope I'm not intruding. Elijah stepped aside, gesturing her in. Please, come in. Vanessa followed him into the living room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She hesitated, eyes flicking toward the framed photos of Amyra on the mantel. I wanted to talk to you, Vanessa said, clearing her throat. About the flight. Elijah's expression softened. Go on. Vanessa shifted again, as if the words themselves were heavy to carry. I saw what happened. I wanted to help, but, she hesitated, biting her lip. Sarah, she made it clear that it wasn't my place. Elijah studied her, reading the discomfort etched into her face. She told you to stay quiet, he said, not as a question but as a quiet confirmation. Vanessa nodded. I've been in this industry long enough to know how it works, she said, her voice tightening. You don't rock the boat. Especially when you're new. But I can't stop thinking about Amyra. I keep wondering how I would feel if that was my child. Elijah nodded slowly, leaning forward. You're not the first to stay quiet, Elijah said, and you won't be the last. But I don't want to be quiet anymore, Vanessa replied, lifting her chin. I want to speak up. Elijah's gaze lingered on her, measuring the sincerity in her eyes. Then speak, he said softly. Later that evening, as Elijah sat at the dinner table with Amyra, his phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa. I spoke to Our. I filed a report. I hope it helps. Elijah set the phone down, the message lingering in his thoughts. Across the table, Amyra scribbled in her journal, pausing now and then to glance at him. Did something happen, Daddy? She asked. Elijah smiled faintly. Maybe. Amyra returned to her sketch. But this time, she didn't draw Sarah. She drew herself sitting in first class. The wind pressed gently against the glass as Elijah stood in his office, watching dusk settle over the city. The streets below stretched out in veins of gold, headlights flickering like fireflies trapped beneath the weight of the skyline. He often found himself here at this hour when the world seemed quieter, when even the city's hum softened just enough to hear the whispers of memory. But tonight, the quiet brought no comfort. On his desk lay a letter from the airline's HR department. Polite, sterile, acknowledgement of Vanessa's complaint. A promise to review internal practices. Elijah had seen letters like this before. He had written them. In boardrooms. He had watched men, not unlike Ethan, craft these responses with the precision of surgeons. Always measured, always restrained, words designed not to ignite but to extinguish. It wasn't the content that haunted Elijah, it was the tone. The unspoken belief that, in time, people forget. But Elijah hadn't forgotten. And neither had Amyra. The following morning, Elijah stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. Amyra sat cross-legged on his bed, her journal balanced carefully on her lap. "Where are you going?" she asked, pencil hovering above the page. "To the airline," Elijah replied. Amyra looked up, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Why?" Elijah met her gaze in the reflection. "Because I need to remind them," he said softly, "that some things shouldn't be forgotten." Amyra didn't say anything, but she nodded, returning to her drawing. Before Elijah left, she handed him a folded piece of paper. "For them," she said simply. Elijah tucked it into his jacket pocket without opening it. The airline's corporate office sat perched on the upper floors of a downtown tower, glass shimmering beneath the morning sun. Elijah stepped into the lobby, his footsteps muted against the marble floor. The receptionist glanced up, recognizing him immediately. "Mr. Ellison," she greeted with polite detachment. "Ethan Reynolds is expecting you." Elijah nodded. Ethan was waiting by the window when Elijah entered his office, hands clasped behind his back. The city stretched out beneath them, as if all the world could be held in the palm of his hand. "Elijah," Ethan said, turning with a well-rehearsed smile. "I didn't expect to see you so soon." Elijah took a seat without invitation, unbuttoning his jacket with quiet deliberation. "I'm not here for pleasantries, Ethan," Elijah replied evenly. Ethan's smile thinned, but he nodded, sinking into the chair across from him. "I understand you've been informed of the incident with Amyra," Elijah continued. "Yes," Ethan said carefully. "And let me start by saying we take this very seriously. Sarah Cole has been counseled." "Counseled," Elijah repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. Ethan folded his hands, leaning slightly forward. "Elijah, you know how this works. There are policies, procedures. We can't make decisions on emotion alone." Elijah's gaze hardened. "Emotion?" he said quietly. "Ethan, this isn't about emotion. It's about respect. It's about the space my daughter occupied for less than 10 minutes before someone decided she didn't belong." Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. "I understand." "No, Ethan, you don't," Elijah interrupted. His voice didn't rise, but the air between them thickened with an unspoken weight. "Because if you did, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Ethan opened his mouth, but Elijah cut him off. "You have children," Elijah said, his tone sharpening. "Would you want them to carry that weight? To learn, at 10 years old, that sometimes the world doesn't see them for who they are but for who it assumes them to be?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Elijah, Elijah reached into his jacket, pulling out the folded paper Amyra had given him. "She wanted me to give you this," Elijah said, placing it carefully on Ethan's desk. Ethan hesitated before unfolding it. It was a drawing, simple but unmistakable. A small figure, Amyra, standing in front of an airplane seat. Next to her, in the blank space where a face should have been, stood a taller figure, Sarah Cole. The words scrawled beneath it were written in Amyra's neat, careful handwriting. "I just wanted to sit where I belonged." Ethan's fingers trembled slightly as he held the paper. For a moment, his practiced composure wavered. Elijah stood, straightening his jacket. "I'm not asking for a letter, Ethan," Elijah said quietly. "I'm asking for change, and this time, I won't accept anything less." Ethan met his gaze, the weight of Amyra's drawing still resting in his hands. For the first time, Elijah thought he saw something else behind Ethan's eyes, something that looked a lot like doubt. That evening, Elijah found Amyra sitting by the window, the fading light casting long shadows across her face. "How did it go?" she asked. Not looking up, Elijah sank into the chair beside her, resting his hand gently on her head. "They saw your drawing," he said. Amyra glanced at him, searching his face for answers. "Did it help?" she asked softly. Elijah thought for a moment, the weight of the day settling over him like a familiar coat. "I think it did," he replied. Amyra nodded and returned to her journal, sketching quietly as the last of the daylight faded into night. Elijah Ellison learned long ago that silence had a shape. Sometimes, it curved around rooms like cigarette smoke, curling beneath doors and pressing itself against the thin walls of polite conversation. Other times, it was hard or sharp, unyielding, the kind that settled in your chest and made itself at home. Now, that silence followed him through the glass-paneled hallways of the airline's corporate office. It hung in the click of his shoes against the floor and in the side-eyed glances of passing employees. Elijah could feel it trailing behind him like an unwanted guest, whispering in the space just outside of hearing. But Elijah didn't slow his pace. Ethan Reynolds had called him back for a follow-up meeting, the kind of meeting where nothing was written down but everything was meant to be understood. The kind of meeting men like Ethan used to remind others where the lines were drawn. Elijah had crossed those lines long ago, and he had no intention of stepping back. The receptionist's voice was smooth but distant as she directed him toward Ethan's office. When Elijah entered, Ethan stood by the window again, just as he had before. This time, there was no rehearsed smile. "Elijah," Ethan greeted, nodding stiffly. "Please, sit." Elijah didn't. "I assume this isn't about Amyra's drawing," Elijah said, his voice calm but pointed. Ethan's gaze flickered toward the empty chair. An invitation unspoken. Elijah remained standing. "No," Ethan admitted, turning to face him. "It's about Sarah." Elijah raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "She's been placed on administrative leave," Ethan continued, crossing his arms over his chest. "Pending further investigation." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "Not suspension?" Ethan exhaled through his nose, as if holding back a sigh. "Elijah, you know how complicated these things can be. I can't fire her outright. There are policies, legal considerations." Elijah stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "There's nothing complicated about respect," Elijah said quietly. "There's nothing complicated about teaching a child she doesn't belong." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he held Elijah's gaze. "I hear you," Ethan replied, voice measured, "but I need you to understand something. Sarah isn't the only one at risk here. If this turns into a public ordeal, it won't stop at her. The board will get involved. And you know as well as I do how quickly these things spiral. We have to be careful." Elijah let the weight of those words settle between them. He knew the game Ethan was playing, the subtle warning wrapped in concern. The implication that pushing too hard might burn more than one house down. But Elijah had spent his whole life standing in rooms like this. Feeling the temperature rise, he leaned in just slightly, his voice low. "Ethan," Elijah said, "you seem to think I'm afraid of fire." Ethan blinked. "I'm not," Elijah continued. "I've walked through it, and I'm still here." The silence that followed was thick, pressing against the walls. Ethan's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Later that afternoon, Elijah picked Amyra up from school. She ran toward the car with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, smiling brightly. "Guess what?" she said as she climbed into the passenger seat. "What's that?" Elijah asked, the tension from his meeting still lingering beneath his skin. "My teacher asked me to draw a picture for the school mural." Amyra beamed. She said my sketches are really good. Elijah smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm proud of you," he said, squeezing her hand gently. As they drove home, Amyra flipped open her journal, sketching quietly in the backseat. Elijah watched her in the rearview mirror, watching how easily she moved from one world to the next. But Elijah's mind stayed in that office, in the echo of Ethan's words. He had left without shaking Ethan's hand. He knew it wouldn't be the last time they stood in that room, circling the same conversation. But Elijah also knew this: every fire starts with a single spark. And sometimes, sparks come from the most unexpected places. The sound of Elijah's footsteps echoed as he crossed the terminal floor. He wasn't supposed to be here today. Amyra's school mural project was scheduled for the afternoon, and he had promised to sit in the front row, watching her unveil it with the pride only a father could know. But promises had a way of bending beneath the weight of unfinished business. Ethan's office was waiting at the end of the long hallway, but Elijah's attention drifted elsewhere, to the rows of travelers, the quiet choreography of movement, and the unspoken separations that filled the space. Airports had always fascinated him. There was something revealing about them, something raw. People came and went, brushing shoulders without ever touching each other's lives. The world pretended that, here, everyone stood on even ground. same terminals, same metal detectors. But Elijah knew better. Because even here, there were sections, lines drawn not in ink, but in glances, assumptions, in who stepped into first class and who was ushered quietly to the back. He wondered if Sarah Cole had ever considered that as she walked these halls. When Elijah reached Ethan's office, the door was already open. Ethan sat behind his desk, flipping through a stack of papers with the kind of focus people pretended to have when they didn't want to face the room. "Ethan," Elijah greeted, stepping inside. Ethan looked up, offering a tight smile. "Elijah, I didn't expect you back so soon. I wasn't planning on it." Elijah sat without waiting for an invitation. Ethan set the papers aside and leaned back, fingers steepled against his chest. "I assume this is about Sarah." Elijah's gaze was steady. "It's about more than Sarah." Ethan sighed, the kind of sigh that implied exhaustion. Though Elijah suspected the weight Ethan carried paled in comparison to the one resting in his own chest. "I spoke to the board," Ethan said. "They're reviewing the situation, but you have to understand. Elijah, these things take time." Elijah leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk between them. "Time," Elijah repeated. "That's the word people use when they're hoping the problem disappears on its own." Ethan flinched, just barely, but enough for Elijah to notice. "It's not that simple," Ethan replied. "Sarah's been with the airline for years. If she goes, there will be questions, pushback from the union." Elijah's expression hardened. "There are already questions, Ethan. You're just not the one asking them." Ethan shifted in his seat, drumming his fingers against the desk. "What do you want, Elijah?" Ethan asked finally, his voice low. "I want more than suspension," Elijah said plainly. "I want to know this won't happen again. To my daughter or anyone else's." Ethan held Elijah's gaze, the tension between them pressing against the walls of the office. And then, Ethan did something Elijah didn't expect. He laughed. It wasn't the kind of laugh born from humor, but from disbelief, like Elijah had asked him to move mountains with his bare hands. "Elijah," Ethan said, shaking his head, "you've been in this business long enough. You know as well as I do that policies don't erase prejudice. People like Sarah, they don't just disappear." Elijah felt the weight of those words settle over him. Ethan wasn't wrong, not entirely. The systems they moved through were older than either of them, and no single meeting, no stern letter, could unwrite the biases stitched into them. But Elijah had never been one to let the weight of history still his hands. "No," Elijah said softly, rising from his seat. "People like Sarah don't disappear." He paused at the door, glancing back over his shoulder. "But they can be reminded. Over and over until they start to wonder if it's worth the cost." That evening, Elijah arrived at Amyra's school late. The mural unveiling had already begun, and he slipped quietly into the back of the gymnasium. Amyra stood near the stage, her small frame illuminated by the overhead lights. She didn't see him right away, but Elijah saw the quiet confidence in the way she held her head high, in the way she gestured toward the mural with outstretched hands. The mural stretched wide across the wall, filled with vibrant colors and bold lines. At the center of it was an image that stopped Elijah cold. A child, seated by the window of an airplane. Her face was turned away, gazing out at the clouds beyond the glass. Beneath it, Amyra had written in neat, careful letters, "We all deserve to fly." Elijah's chest tightened. When the ceremony ended, Amyra found him near the exit, her eyes lighting up as she ran to his side. "You saw it?" she asked, her voice bubbling with excitement. "I did," Elijah replied, kneeling to her level. "It's beautiful." Amyra beamed. "You know," Elijah said, brushing a curl from her forehead. "Sometimes, people need to be reminded of that." "Of what?" Amyra asked. Elijah smiled softly. "That we all deserve to fly." Elijah stood at the edge of the playground, watching as Amyra chased a soccer ball across the field. Her laughter carried in the breeze, light and easy, unburdened by the weight he felt pressing down on his chest. He marveled at the resilience children carried, how they could brush aside the small humiliations of the world, tucking them neatly beneath their beds like forgotten toys. But Elijah knew better. He knew those moments didn't disappear. They collected quietly, like stones dropped into deep water, their ripples stretching far beyond sight. Amyra's mural lingered in his thoughts, the image of the child by the airplane window etched into his mind. "We all deserve to fly." A simple phrase, But simple things had a way of holding the most truth. Later that evening, Elijah's phone buzzed. It was Vanessa. "They're letting her go," Vanessa said, skipping pleasantries. Her voice was clear but taut, like someone standing on the edge of something uncertain. Elijah said nothing for a moment, letting the words settle. He had imagined this call for days, played out the scenario in his mind. But now that it was here, it felt hollow, incomplete. "Is that supposed to feel like victory?" Elijah asked finally. Vanessa hesitated. "I thought you'd want to know. You fought for this, didn't you?" Elijah exhaled slowly, leaning against the kitchen counter. "I didn't fight for someone to lose their job, Vanessa. I fought for my daughter to feel like she belongs." On the other end, Vanessa was quiet. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost apologetic. "I think it's a start," she said. Elijah nodded, though she couldn't see him. "Maybe," he replied, "but starts are fragile. They crack under too much weight." A week passed before Elijah returned to the airport. This time, Amyra was at his side, her small hand wrapped securely in his as they navigated the bustling terminal. She tilted her head up toward him. "Why are we here, Daddy?" "I have a meeting," Elijah said simply. "But I thought you didn't work here." "I don't," Elijah replied, "but sometimes you have to show up anyway." They made their way through security, past the long lines and announcements humming overhead. As they walked, Amyra's eyes wandered, watching travelers pull heavy luggage behind them, their expressions ranging from excitement to exhaustion. "Are you nervous?" she asked, glancing up at him. Elijah smiled faintly. "No," he said, "but I think Ethan might be." The conference room at the airline's headquarters was glass-walled, with the skyline stretching wide beyond it. Ethan sat at the far end, his face unreadable, but his eyes flicked briefly to Amyra as Elijah entered. "Didn't expect you to bring company," Ethan said, rising to shake Elijah's hand. "She's why we're here," Elijah replied. Amyra held her journal close, flipping it open to reveal new sketches as she sat quietly beside her father. She didn't say much, but her presence filled the room, reminding Ethan why Elijah's voice carried weight. Ethan cleared his throat, clasping his hands together. "We've updated our training policies," he began, "implemented new diversity programs, bias awareness sessions." "I read the memo," Elijah interrupted gently. "It's a good start." Ethan nodded, though something about his posture suggested he expected more, perhaps even deserved more for the effort. "But let me ask you something, Ethan," Elijah continued, leaning slightly forward. "Do you think Sarah Cole was the only one?" Ethan hesitated. "Because I don't," Elijah said. "And neither do you." Ethan's eyes flickered toward Amyra. She was drawing quietly, but Elijah could tell she was listening. Children had a way of hearing what wasn't meant for them. "I know it's not just Sarah," Ethan admitted carefully, "but we're working on it. Change takes time." Elijah's gaze softened, but his voice held steady. "You know what the problem with time is, Ethan? It's not something my daughter has in endless supply. And neither do I." Ethan looked away, studying the skyline beyond the window. "I'm not asking you to change the whole system overnight," Elijah said, his voice low. "I'm asking you to make sure that the next time a little girl boards this plane, she sits where she belongs." Ethan met his gaze, the weight of the request hanging between them. "I'll see to it," Ethan replied finally. Elijah nodded, rising to leave. Amyra slipped her hand into his as they walked toward the door. But before they reached it, she paused, glancing back at Ethan. "Mr. Reynolds?" she said softly. Ethan looked at her, surprised. "I drew you something," she said, holding up a page from her journal. It was another drawing of the plane. This time, the child by the window wasn't alone. A flight attendant stood beside her, not Sarah, but someone unfamiliar, their face kind and welcoming. Ethan studied the drawing, his fingers brushing over the paper. "Thank you, Amyra," he said quietly. Amyra smiled. "I think people are nicer when someone draws them that way." Elijah chuckled softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "She's been saying that since she was 7, he said. Ethan's lips curled into a faint smile. "Maybe she's right." As Elijah and Amyra stepped into the hallway, Amyra looked up at her father. "Do you think it'll really be different next time?" she asked. Elijah considered the question carefully. "I think," he said, "the next time will feel lighter. And that's how it starts." Amyra squeezed his hand, and together, they walked toward the sky.